that was very telling because it corresponded, of course, also to people knowing their neighbors. Now, when I was a kid in the early 50s, everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
We all visited each other. Everybody took care of everybody else's kids. You know, I could wander around all over my town, and I did. You know, say hi to people, you know, and all that.
And your mama would know about anything you did before you got home.
Well, except I didn't do anything. And really, almost none of us did,
Right.
because we knew that everybody was watching us.
Right.
The expression was revived some years ago, as you may recall. It takes a village.
Ah, yes.
Well, in those days we had a village.
Right.
It wasn't a village of government, though. It was a village of neighbors.
Right.
Well, I also observed the tendency, again in the 50s, for that to break down. A lot of new people moving into town, and not knowing each other, with cocooning into their houses, not going out and socializing, and you know, I could watch it happen, you know, play out in front of my eyes. And one of the things I did when I was still a little kid, you know, I spoke to my grandparents and my parents and other people, and I noted the historical changes that had taken place in their lives. And I said, I'm going to be living through an interesting period of history. I need to pay attention to what's going on around me, because some of my grandparents and parents weren't really paying that much attention. They were just living, they weren't really observing.
Right.
So I said, I'm going to be an observer. I'm going to pay attention to what's going on around me so that later on I can understand it.
Right.
So I have tried to do that.
That's my cell phone, sorry.
Okay.
I forgot to turn it on silent.
All right. It sounded like an ice cream truck.
It's nice. It's better than the piercing sounds.
Yes. Anyway, so I found that by paying attention to what's going on around me, not just to news reports or historical events, but to the ordinary daily life of ordinary people, and how historical events were not only taking place and being reported, but affecting ordinary people.
Right.
To try to understand the changes that are taking place. And I think I've been moderately successful at that. Particularly when I speak to some of my social conservative friends, most of whom are upset about this or that change they've seen in society, and most of them are really not very good at attributing the correct causes for those changes. They see one change that they don't like, they see another change that occurred at the same time, and they think that this caused that. Well, in most cases, this didn't cause that.
Right.
They just happened to occur at the same time.
Right.
Sometimes they had common causes. Sometimes it's just a coincidence. But if you don't understand the real causes of things, you won't come up with the right solutions for them. So I have wound up engaging in a lot of arguments with not only social conservative friends, I have liberal friends that have their own concerns. And there's a general tendency not to understand what really caused the changes, the things that they're concerned about, or what to do about them. I'm not one of those who says that the good old days were all that much better than they are today.
Every decade has its own challenges.
Right. There are a lot of things that have gotten worse. A lot of things have gotten better. I wouldn't trade the internet for anything. But coming out of World War II, then the Korean War, we had a level of civic virtue that we didn't have before or since. William James wrote about this in his famous essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. He was concerned about civic virtue and observed that with every war it increased and then declined between wars. And of course, he was not in favor of war. He didn't want to have a war just to get civic virtue. So he tried to come up with some alternative to war that would generate civic virtue.
And is this an essay you have on your website?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not very satisfied with what he came up with, and really probably neither was he. But it does illustrate the problem. Civic virtue is very difficult to achieve and maintain, especially when times are good. This country was founded during a rough period. The American Revolution was hard on everybody. But it was a wonderful incubator of the ideas that have made this country great. However, once the revolution was won, the Constitution was adopted, things started going downhill. And of course, one of the reasons why they went downhill is because times were good, relative, by historic standards anyway. Lots of opportunities, a lot of free land, you know, plenty of people moving in and getting jobs and building industries and planting farms and cutting down the trees and just having a good old time.
Right.
Not that there weren't plenty of problems. We had a civil war, but which could have easily been avoided. But it was a exciting time, but not one that cultivated the kind of civic virtue that makes for constitutional government. So the question is then, how do we somehow recapture that kind of civic virtue? Well, it's not easy, it's not obvious. I, of course, devote a lot of my time and effort to doing that. This proposal, this nullification proposal, is in part a way to try to do that.
What would you say to people who think that doing something like mandatory civil service would increase civic virtue among particularly young people? Usually they want the kids who graduate high school. They don't talk about the guys in their 50s and 60s having to do this. What do you say to people who think, well, that's a good idea? Because I know that was a small discussion, a tiny short period in the '08 elections was given to that discussion. What do you think of that?
Well, actually, I'm in favor of that if done right. The key concept is militia. The militia were supposed to be that.
Right.
When this country was founded, it was run by militia and juries. In other words, volunteers. They didn't need to pay, you know, to raise taxes or pay public servants to do things because the citizens did it on their own.
Right.
What we would need to do in today's terms would be to train young people especially in the arts of defense, law enforcement, disaster response, and so forth, at a minimum. And of course, the skills needed by militia today are the same skills we teach in public schools. So the question was asked, you may recall it, at the State Board of Education session. You know, one of the members say, you know, sort of asked rhetorically, do you know of any provision of the Constitution that authorizes the federal funding of public education? And I don't think he said federal funding, but anyway, federal activity in this area. Actually, there is such a provision. It's the militia clause on training, training the militia. And today, training the militia means not just in defense, law enforcment, and disaster response. It also means reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, map reading, you know,
Right.
all the stuff that's taught in the military academies.
Right.
What is missing from that is it needs to be not just academic, it needs to be practical too.
Right.